All right, fastest 15 minutes on the internet, fastest 15 minutes on the internet. My name is Judson Powell. I want to talk today about voting, and voting is very important. I'm sorry, but Dr. Boyce Watkins and Dr. Claude Anderson, I don't agree with you. And I want to explain why I don't agree. They're pretty much saying that our vote doesn't matter, but I'm under a different impression, and I want to explain why. First of all, during after we were freed from being slaves, the everything that was created to keep us so that we wouldn't vote. So one of the all the Jim Crow laws, all of the everything was directed at voter suppression. Even lynchings and most of the lynchings and things like that occurred whenever we started to become economically powerful or when we started to vote, because voting is the key in our type of government. The vote and the census are the two most important things. And I don't think that they really realize that. Or maybe they do realize that, but they think that that there's no place for it anymore in the strategy that we try to use in order to redeem and to reclaim what we had. So, and I want to explain why it's important. When I was back in the 90s, the late 90s, I was trying to research my family history and my family tree. And we come from Southampton County, Virginia, same place where Nat Turner came from. And so I was going through the courthouse records trying to find documents because my grandfather, my great grandfather, he died from smallpox, which was given, as you know, to many of the natives and the indigenous people of Turtle Island, which is what the United States was called back then. But and so I was just trying to find out where the man was buried because they never gave him a proper burial, and we have cemeteries down there where the rest of the family is buried. And so I was just trying to find out where he was. And so then I started looking, and I was like looking through the census records, and I started looking at all this stuff, and I realized something later on. I didn't realize it right then, but then I realized it is that after the slaves were freed, the census records changed. They changed drastically. And here's what I mean. Okay, everything is involved in the vote and the census. The lines, the districting lines, all of those lines are drawn according to the census, where people live. And so what their politicians did, what the establishment politicians did, was that they drew lines so that there would be certain districts. Because if you notice, like, look at like Senator Jesse Helms was a senator in North Carolina. There were like senators in these different states for years. Strom Thurmond, those are a couple of the, or you look at people like George Wallace or people like that who kept on winning elections. And they were devout racists. They were racist, and they weren't trying to hold back the fact that they were racist. Well, the reason why they kept getting elected is because they kept drawing these district lines, and they would redraw them according to basically so that they would have a majority of the population determined by the census. Now, of course, black people, because of lynchings and all that kind of stuff, we were afraid. We were afraid to answer the census. Now, before we were freed, guess what? We didn't have to answer the census. Why? Because the slave owners, the slave masters, the slave holders, they took the census and they made sure that it was meticulously documented. Why? Because at that particular point, we were still property. And so they wanted to have, not only did they want to have us counted in the population, but they wanted to count us as property. And I remember looking at many documents where it said like, where they would have like slaves, they would have their silverware, they would have, even in wills and trusts, all of these different things you would see, and they would have it meticulously labeled, because of their property, because slaves were chattel property. They were considered personable or personality, as it's called in the law. So they made sure all of this stuff was documented. Well, as we became more fearful, just like right now, the Mexicans are not going to answer the census when they're deporting people. They're not going to tell you how many people. They're not going to say where they are and how many of them there are, so that you can come in and deport them or kill them or whatever. And that's how we thought. So we stopped answering the census. So after slavery, after 1865, there was no accurate count, all right, of who was there. And so these people kept on winning elections. These white supremacists kept on winning elections. But guess what? The places where they were winning these elections were high density black areas. And I talked about this on another post. These high density black areas were discovered, or they weren't discovered, they were already known, but they weren't used again until television and radio started using it for ratings. And so because they wanted to get ratings, and ratings equal what? Advertising dollars. So they went out. And if you notice, you go to every major city and you'll notice that the basically the top rated television stations and the top rated radio stations are basically formatted to Africans and descendants of Africans and descendants of slaves, or black folks, we'll just say that. But just trying to give due respect to everybody. Now, if you notice this, the highest density black areas are the corridor in between what? Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And then the second biggest high density black area is the Mississippi Delta, which includes basically Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana. So if you look at all of this stuff, right, and you're trying to figure out, it's like, well, if you don't vote, because look, all of the power, so power, we're not talking about money, we're just talking about if you want to get positions in the government, all of the power basically is in, as far as high density being like a large population areas, were in those areas. And then in the major cities in the Northeast, that, because think about it, all of the places that ended up like in the early 70s that had African American mayors, right? They were major cities, but they had been populated by people that moved from the South to the North because of the Industrial Revolution. So everybody moved from the South to the North because what? There were factories. There were factories in Pennsylvania. There were factories in Detroit. There are factories in Cleveland and in Chicago and all of these places. So people moved there so that they could make money. Indiana, so think about it. So all those places in the Northeast, all of a sudden, or the Midwest, all of a sudden, they were being repopulated by the people that came from the South. But guess what? That didn't change the population in the South, because people in the South, especially black people, still have very strong strongholds in the South. So now you say, well, we don't need to vote. Well, yes, you do, because look, the census, if you look at the census, and we have historically not answered the census, and there have been all kinds of programs and promotions and everything else to try to get African descendants of Africans and African Americans to what? To answer the census. Why? Because it's a known fact. It is a known fact that the population statistics are not really what they are. And now let's fast forward to today and Donald Trump. The reason why Donald Trump is so much against the Mexicans and so much against anybody else that comes here that's not this, like, they don't, there are estimated, I think they said there are like 600,000 illegal Europeans in the country, illegals, but they're not going after them. But if you're Haitian, if you're Mexican, if you're South American or Central American, any other African, what he called the shithole countries, right? You're going to be, they're looking for you and they're trying to deport you. And the reason is because they understand that the population, the census, determines the ebb and flow of power and money in the United States of America. That's what our law is. And see, so if you come to them and you're like, okay, well, this is the law, what can they really say? Except for that they do like Trump and ignore the law. Oh, I don't have to give up my tax returns. I don't have to, disclose, my private business things that I'm doing in order to make money from being president and all that kind of stuff. So that's what it's really all about. And now, even to the point where, they're threatening civil war, if Trump is impeached. Think about it. All right. And the reason why they're doing this, the reason why they got all of these, I'm telling you, the reason why they have all of this stuff going on is because they're afraid of the population and they're afraid of the census. And they know that if everybody voted, right, if everybody voted, they would be in major trouble. They couldn't win an election. They really didn't win any election. They really didn't, and the Electoral College is another method of voter suppression, because we know that Al Gore won his election against Bush, and we know that Hillary, won the election against Trump. But the only thing is that they use these skewed out districting lines and weighted, all these different other things. But if it really was one person, one vote, they couldn't win an election. Which is why the Electoral College needs, which I've been advocating for that. The Electoral College needs to be done away with. There's no reason for it. There's not a single reason in the world for the Electoral College to exist, because it's not like it was. People know who the candidates are. People who are involved in politics. We have networks now. We have, all kinds of things. People know. It's not like in the 1800s or something, 17 and 1800s, when there was not that many newspapers and people may not have been informed about who the candidates are. But now we have debates. I mean, we have debates almost every week, or we have information being disseminated every single day about the politicians and the elections. So Electoral College is not necessary. So that's why. So these high density black areas and these high density, and then you have out west, you have high density Mexican areas. These people out here, I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm telling you right now, in Arizona, in California, in New Mexico, in Nevada, all of these places, they have very high density Mexican populations. But they're not gonna come out and answer the census, and they're not gonna come out and vote because people have made them afraid. That's the whole thing. That's why it is imperative that be changed around. That's why it's imperative, because they know that, and that's why they're scared. The whole thing, the fear of a black planet, the whole Public Enemy thing that came out in the 80s, and they have been afraid since that. And they realize that they don't have enough votes. They can't control anything. If everybody registered and voted, they would have no ability to control anything in the United States of America under the laws, absent having a civil war. They would have to have a civil war, because that would be the only way. They would have to do something that was unscrupulous and illegal. That's the only way. Even for them to call for that is treasonous. Even for them to say that there should be a civil war is treasonous. It basically is. So that's how they've been able to keep power and control over everything, and that's how money is spent. That's why they're able to conform to systemic racism. One of the things, why do you think that one of the main things is, like, when people go to prison or do crimes or whatever, the first thing they do is what? They take away their right to vote. And then they don't want to, in all the states, they're arguing about restoring people's rights to vote. So I'm just putting it out there. And one last thing, Jesse Jackson talked about it, and he said, look, we never lost any county where all the blacks and all the Mexicans went and registered and voted. So if you register and you vote, you can't lose. But what happens is, when we get these people that are apathetic, and we saw what happened with apathy, that's why Trump is president. Trump is president because of voter apathy, not because we don't have enough votes. We got plenty of votes. We got plenty of people. One thing black folks do, one thing Mexicans do is they have children. I got 7 myself, so I know we have children. Anyway, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the hit the what is it, the notification button, hit all the buttons, and most of all, hit the love button. I love you all, and vote.